The story of a common soldier of Army life in the Civil War, 1861 to 1865 by Leander Stillwell is a vivid first-hand account of an ordinary Union soldier's journey from enlistment to the harsh realities of battle and camp life. If you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe. These are Stillwell's words. Let's begin. On June 20th, we left Huntersville on the cars and went to Hicks Station, hereinbefore mentioned, and there went into camp. In making this move, we left Little Rock for the last time, and from that day, I have never seen the old town again. But our stay at Hicks Station was brief. Marching orders came on June 24th, and on the next day, we left on the cars and went to Devall's Bluff. On reaching there, we filed on board the steamer Kentucky and started down White River, accompanied by several other boats also loaded with troops, all under the command of General E. A. Carr. The object and purpose of this expedition were soon noised around among the men. The daring and enterprising Confederate General Shelby had, on June 24th, turned up at Clarendon, on White River, not far below Devall's Bluff, and there, with the aid of his artillery, had surprised and captured one of our so-called tin-clad gunboats and had established a blockade of the river. As all our supplies came by way of that stream, it was necessary to drive Shelby away at once, hence our movement. We arrived at Clarendon on the morning of the 26th. Some of our gunboats were with us in advance, and as soon as they came within range of the town, they began shelling it in the woods beyond. The cannonade elicited no reply, and it was soon ascertained that the enemy had fallen back from the river. The transports thereupon landed, the men marched on shore, formed in line of battle, and advanced. The Confederates were found in force about 2 miles northeast of town, and some lively skirmishing and artillery practice began. But our regiment was stationed in the supporting line and did not get to pull a trigger. Cannon shots went over our heads now and then, but hurt nobody. While the racket was going on, we were standing in line of battle on the hither side of an extensive cotton field. There was a big, tall cottonwood tree standing about 1/4 of a mile in our front by the side of the road. I was looking in that direction when suddenly, as if by magic, a big forked branch of this tree quietly took leave of the trunk, as if it didn't know how it happened. Before it struck the ground, the shot from one of Shelby's guns that had done this pruning went screaming over our heads. It sounded just real good, like old times, with an effect, somehow, like a powerful tonic. But the affair did not last long. Shelby had no stomach for fighting infantry, well supplied with artillery, and he soon fell back and rapidly retreated in a northerly direction, leaving 2 pieces of his artillery in our possession. When the Confederates retired, we followed promptly and vigorously, but of course, the infantry could not overhaul them, and neither could our cavalry bring them to a determined stand. Our route was largely through a low, swampy country, over a corduroy road. In many places, there were large gaps in the corduroy, where the logs had rotted and disappeared, and the road was covered with green and slimy water about knee-deep. On encountering the first of these breaks, we took off our shoes and socks, tied them to the ends of the barrels of our muskets, rolled up our trousers, and waded in. As such places were numerous, it was not worthwhile to resume our footwear, so we just trudged on barefooted. But the weather was warm, and it made no difference. The boys would splash through the mud and water in great good humor, laughing and joking as they went. We followed hard after Shelby until the evening of the 27th, and, it being impossible to catch up with him, we started back to Clarendon on the morning of the 28th. In the matter of rations, I reckon someone had blundered when we started in pursuit of Shelby. We had left Clarendon with only a meager supply in our haversacks, and no provision train was with the command. So, at the time we took the back track, we were out of anything to eat. The country bordering on our route was wild and thinly settled, and the people who lived there were manifestly quite poor. Hence, there was very little in the shape of anything to eat that we could forage. On the first day of our return march, our commissary sergeant, Bonfoy, did manage to capture and kill a gaunt, lean old Arkansas steer, and it was divided up among the men with almost as much nicety and exactness as if it was a wedding cake with a prize diamond ring in it. We did not have any salt to go with it, but in lieu of that, we used gunpowder, which was a sort of substitute. With that exception, and a piece of hardtack to be presently mentioned, my bill of fare on the return march until we reached Clarendon consisted, in the main, of a green, knotty apple and some sassafras buds. About the middle of the afternoon on the second day, the regiment made a temporary halt for some purpose, and we were sitting or lying down along the roadside. There was a bunch of our cavalry on their horses, in column off the road a short distance, also at a halt, and I saw one of them munching a hardtack. I slipped out of ranks and approached the fellow, and when close to him said, "Partner, won't you give me a hardtack?" He looked at me a second or two without saying anything, and I was fearful that my appeal was going to be denied. But the look of ravenous hunger in my eyes probably gained the case, for at last, he reached his hand into his haversack and handed me a tack, one of the big kinds about 4 or 5 inches square. I was barely in time, for right then the cavalry moved on. I thrust the tack into my shirt bosom, gave a quick, furtive glance towards the company to see if anyone had observed me, and then started to get behind a big tree, where the precious morsel could be devoured without risk of detection. But John Barton had been watching and was upon me before I could hide. "Hold on, Stillwell," said he, "that don't go. I divided with you as long as I had a crumb." "That's so, John," I replied, heaving a mournful sigh. "Here." Breaking the hardtack in two, I gave him a fair half, and standing behind the tree, we promptly gobbled down our respective portions. We arrived at Clarendon on the evening of the 29th, having marched, in going and returning, about 70 miles. Here, everybody got a square meal, which was heartily appreciated. As bearing on the above-mentioned incident about the hardtack, it will be said here, basing my remarks on my experience in the army and elsewhere, that I think there is nothing that will reduce human beings so much to the level of the brute creation as intense, gnawing hunger. All the selfishness there is in a man will then come to the surface, and to satisfy the well-nigh intolerable craving for something to eat, he will go back on his best friend. I could cite several instances in support of this statement that have come under my observation, but it is unnecessary. Soon after reaching Clarendon, as above stated, fires burst forth, apparently simultaneously, all over the town, and soon every building was in ashes. It was a small place, and its population at the beginning of the war probably did not exceed 300. At this time, the town had been abandoned by the residents, and so far as I know, the houses were all vacant. The buildings were small frame or log structures, composed of cypress and pine lumber or logs, roofed with shingles, and highly combustible. They made an exceedingly hot fire. I do not know the cause of the burning of the town. The soldiers were tired, mad, and out of sorts generally, and they may have fired it on their own motion, but it is more likely that it was done by order of the military authorities. The empty houses afforded excellent cover whereby the Confederates could slip up to the river bank and annoy our gunboats, even to the extent of capturing one, as they had done quite recently. So, as a military measure, the burning of the town was fully justified. We left Clarendon on the evening of the 29th on the steamer Lily Martin, arrived at Deval's Bluff sometime during the night, debarked from the boat the next morning, and went into camp near the river, where we enjoyed, for a time, an agreeable rest. Before taking final leave of the Clarendon expedition, I will, in the interest of the truth of history, indulge in a little criticism of the gallant and distinguished officer who was the Confederate commander in this affair. All who are conversant with the military career of General J.O. Shelby will readily concede that he was a brave, skillful, and energetic cavalry commander. He kept us in hot water almost continually in the Trans-Mississippi Department and made us a world of trouble. But I feel constrained to remark that, in reporting his military operations, he was sometimes a most monumental, well, I'll scratch out the short and ugly word I have written and substitute artist and let it go at that. I have just been reading his reports of this Clarendon episode, as they appear on pages 1050 to 1053, serial number 61, official records of the War of the Rebellion, and as he describes it, it is difficult to recognize it as being the same affair we took part in June 1864. In the first place, he says that the loss of the Federals can safely be put down at 250 killed and wounded, and that 30 will cover his own. On the other hand, our commander, General Carr, says the Confederate loss, killed, wounded, and captured, was about 74 and gives ours as 1 killed and 16 wounded, Ib. p. 1047. From what I personally saw, I have no doubt that General Carr's statements are correct. Shelby further asserts that 3 times he drove us back to the river, and that later, while on his retreat, he charged us and drove us, back 3 miles in confusion. Now, those statements are pure moonshine. I was there, and while, as previously stated, not on the firing line, I was nevertheless in a position either to see or hear everything of any material consequence that transpired. The force on each side was comparatively small, the field of active operations was limited, and it was not difficult for even a common soldier to have an intelligent idea of what was going on. For my part, with the natural curiosity of a boy, I was constantly on the alert to see or hear everything that was being done in the shape of fighting. In the operations near the town, we were not driven back to the river, nor towards it, on any occasion. On his retreat, Shelby did make one or two feeble stands, the object being merely to delay us until his main body could get well out of the way, and when that was accomplished, his rearguard galloped after them as fast as they could. That it was mainly a race with him to get away is evident from a statement in his report, in which he says he was then, June 30th, resting his tired and terribly jaded horses. But, in telling of his exploits, he says nothing about losing 2 pieces of his artillery. The saying of Bonaparte's, false as a war bulletin, has passed into a proverb, and this bulletin of General Shelby's is no exception. I have said nothing so far about grand reviews or other functions of that sort, and here is as good a place as any to notice them. For some cause or other, we had what seemed to us an undue proportion of grand reviews in Arkansas in the summer of 1864. They were not a bit popular with the common soldiers. It became a saying among us, when a grand review was ordered, that the reviewing officer had gotten a new uniform and wanted to show it, but, of course, that was only soldier talk. On June 10, while in camp at Huntersville, all the troops at Little Rock were reviewed by Major General Daniel E. Sickles, late of the Army of the Potomac. He lost a leg at the Battle of Gettysburg, which incapacitated him for active service, so President Lincoln gave him a sort of roving commission to visit and inspect all the Western troops. In conducting the review at Little Rock, on account of his maimed condition, he rode along the line in an open carriage. The day was exceedingly hot, the troops on our side of the river were reviewed on low grounds where the air was stifling, we wore our jackets tightly buttoned, and we all suffered fearfully from the heat. One man in the line near me went over with a crash, all in a pile, from sunstroke, and I heard that there were several other such cases. 9 days later, on June 19, we had a division grand review conducted by our division commander, General C.C. Andrews, and on July 11, another grand review by the same officer. Interspersed with the reviews were several brigade inspections of arms. But as those did not involve any marching, they were not as fatiguing as the reviews. I will mention specifically but one of these inspections, and do so for the reason that there were some things connected with it I have always remembered with interest and pleasure. It was held on July 4, at Devall's Bluff, the inspecting officer being Colonel Randolph B. Marcy, Inspector General of the United States Army. He was a regular Army officer, a graduate of West Point, and at this time was about 52 years of age. He was over 6 feet tall, straight as an arrow, and a splendid-looking man in general. We had very short notice of this inspection, and having returned only a few days before from the Clarendon expedition, we had not yet had time or opportunity to wash our shirts and were in quite a rough and tough condition. The fact that this inspection was to be conducted by the Inspector General of the United States Army, an old regular, and a West Point graduate, made us nervous, and we apprehended all sorts of trouble. So far as I ever knew, the volunteers had not much love for the regular Army officers. We regarded them as unreasonably strict and technical, and were of the impression that they were inclined to look down on volunteers. Whether this feeling was well-founded or not, I cannot say, but there is no question that it existed. On this occasion, we went to work with a will and soon had our muskets, bayonets, belt plates, and accoutrements in general bright and shining, and in the very pink of condition. It was to be an inspection of arms only and did not include knapsacks. About 9 o'clock on the morning of July 4, we fell in on the regimental parade ground, broke into columns of companies, right in front, in open order, and the greatly feared Inspector General entered on his duty. As already stated, we looked hard. Many of us were barefoot, and our clothes in general were dirty and ragged. But Colonel Marcy knew we had just come off a march. He was a very sensible man, and capable of making some allowances. In accordance with the regulations, he passed in front of us, walking slowly and looking at us critically. As he came opposite each soldier, the latter brought his piece into the prescribed position for examination, but Colonel Marcy contented himself with a sweeping glance and did not take the musket in his hands. Then he passed to the rear of the ranks and walked slowly along behind us, while we stood immovable, with eyes fixed to the front. It was soon all over. He then approached Colonel Orr, said something I did not hear, but which was evidently pleasant, for the colonel smiled, then turned around facing us, and with a sweep of his arm in our direction said, loud enough for many of us to hear, "Good soldiers." Whereupon we all felt much relieved and proud, and the dreaded inspection was a thing of the past. Several years afterward, when in civil life out in Kansas, I learned that Colonel Marcy was not only a grand old soldier but also a most interesting writer. I have two of his books in my library now and have had them for many years, one being his official report of the exploration of the Red River of Louisiana, in the year 1852, the other, 30 Years of Army Life on the Border. Both are highly interesting, and I frequently take them from the shelf and look them over. When I do so, there always rises up on about every page the recollection of the tall, imposing figure of Colonel Marcy, as he stood beneath the oaks at Devall's Bluff, Arkansas, on the morning of July 4, 1864, and waved his arm towards us, and said in a kind tone, and with an approving look, "Good soldiers." There was in Company D an original sort of character by the name of Ambrose Presley Allender, generally called Press for short. He was, at this time, 1864, about 35 years old. He had been a private in a regiment of Kentucky infantry during the Mexican War, but what the length of his service may have been, I do not know. However, in his Mexican War experience, he had at least learned every possible trick and device that could be resorted to in playing off, as the boys called it, that is, avoiding duty on the plea of sickness or any other excuse that would serve. He was not a bad man by any means but a good-hearted old fellow. He had re-enlisted, along with the rest of us, when the regiment veteranized, but his propensity for shirking duty, especially anything severe or unpleasant, seemed inveterate and incurable. He made me lots of trouble for some time after I became first sergeant. I was only a boy, and he was a man of mature age, about 15 years my senior. Looking back to those days, I can see now where, many times, he pulled the wool over my eyes completely and induced me to grant him favors in the matter of details that he was not entitled to. But it was not long before I began to understand Press, and then, if he was excused from duty or passed over for a lighter job, the authority had to come from the regimental surgeon. Dr. Julius P. Anthony, of Brown County, Illinois, was appointed surgeon of the regiment in September 1863 and remained with us in that capacity until we were mustered out of the service. He was not a handsome man by any means. He was hawk-nosed, with steel-blue eyes, and had a most peculiar sort of high-keyed, nasal-toned voice. But he was an excellent physician and a shrewd, accurate judge of men. So when Press bucked up against Dr. Anthony, he found a foeman worthy of his steel, and the keen-eyed old doctor was a different proposition from a boy orderly sergeant. Press would keep close watch of the details as they progressed down the company roll, and when he was next in turn, and the impending duty was one he did not fancy, he would then retire to his tent or shack. When wanted for picket or some laborious fatigue duty, he would be found curled up in his bunk and groaning dismally. When we were at Devall's Bluff, around the last of July 1864, I discovered him in this condition one morning before sick call, when I went to apprise him, out of abundant caution, that he was next for duty and not to wander from the camp. He forthwith told me he was very sick, had not slept a wink all night, and that I must pass over him for the time being. I replied that if he was sick, he must fall in at sick call and have the surgeon pass on his case. So he climbed out of his bunk, put on his trousers, and made ready. Sick call was sounded pretty soon, and I went with Press and 2 or 3 of the other boys to the surgeon's tent. Press kept in the background until the other cases were disposed of and then stepped forward. His breeches were unbuttoned down to nearly the last button, he was holding them up with his hands, and his stomach protruded like the belly of a brood sow. "Well, Allender," inquired Dr. Anthony, "egad, what's the matter with you?" Press was careful to put on all the military frills at such a time, and he began thus: "Major Anthony, First Sergeant Stillwell has several times putted me on duty when I was not fitted for duty, and so I am now compelled to come to you, and—" "That'll do, Allender," interrupted the doctor. "What are your symptoms?" Press then began the story of his woes. He had racking pains in the stomach, headache, could not sleep, all bloated up, he said, as you can see for yourself, with a comprehensive gesture towards his abdominal region, and numerous other troubles, including night sweats. Dr. Anthony heard him patiently and without interruption but scanned him closely all the time he was talking. Press at last stopped to take a breath, and then the doctor, in his rasping voice, spoke as follows: "Allender, the trouble with you is simply exercising too little and eating too much. And if you do not quit stuffing yourself and get around more, I shall instruct Sergeant Stillwell to put you on fatigue duty every day until you are rid of that mass of fermenting fecal matter in your bowels, and your stomach is restored to normal condition. That's all." Then, addressing me, he said, "Allender is able for duty," and Press and I walked out. As soon as we were beyond the hearing of Dr. Anthony, Press turned loose. He was a terribly profane fellow when, in his opinion, ordinary language would not do the subject justice, and he had accumulated a stock of the most unique and outrageous expressions that could be invented, and all these he now fired at the doctor. Having no desire to put salt on a green wound, I said nothing. In perhaps an hour or so, the first sergeant's call was sounded at the adjutant's tent, which meant a detail. I responded to the call, and the sergeant major, consulting the regimental detail slip he held in his hand, told me he wanted a corporal and 5 privates from my company, with 2 days' rations, to help make up a scouting party going up White River on a steamboat, and for them to report in 15 minutes. That caught old Press, and I went to his shack expecting a scene. He was found lying on his bunk in his drawers and shirt, as usual in such emergencies. I proceeded to detail him as one of the scouting party and told him to be all ready within 15 minutes. In the meantime, the weather had changed, and a disagreeable, drizzling rain was falling. Press heaved a deep sigh when informed of his detail and began to beg and protest. I told him that the doctor had refused to excuse him, that he was the next man on the roll for duty, that I had no discretion in the matter, and that he would have to get ready and go. But if he was feeling worse, I would go with him again to the doctor and request him to look further into his case. Press sprang out of his bunk with a bound and grabbed his trousers. "Before I'll ever go again," he said, "to that hawk-nosed old blankety-blank to get excused from duty, I'll see him in hell further than a pigeon can fly in a leap year. He hasn't got sense enough, anyhow, to doctor an old Dominecker hen that is sick with a sore anus, much less a civilized human being. You could let me off this detail if you wanted to, and let me tell you, Stillwell, if this trip kills me, which it probably will, I want you to remember, as long as you live, that the responsibility for my death lies on your head." This last statement, I will confess, rather staggered me, and had it been delivered in a weak and pitiful tone, there is no telling what I might have done. But he did not roar me as gently as a sucking dove, by a long shot, for his voice was full and loud, and quivering with energy and power. So I made no response to this dire prediction. Press got ready and went. The weather cleared up in a few hours and was bright and pleasant, but nevertheless, I became very uneasy about Press. I waited anxiously for the return of the scouting party, and when the whistle of the boat was heard on its arrival at the bluff, I went at once to the landing to learn the fate of Press. Presently, here came Press, very much alive and looking fine. He bore, transfixed on his bayonet, a home-cured ham of an Arkansas hog. The tail feathers of a chicken were ostentatiously protruding from the mouth of his haversack, which was also stuffed well-nigh to bursting with big, toothsome yams. Later, it was discovered that his canteen was full of sorghum molasses. From this time on, I had no more trouble with old Press. He turned over a new leaf, cut out his old malingering practices, and thenceforward was a good, faithful soldier. He was mustered out with the rest of us in September 1865 and, after some going and coming, settled down in Peoria County, Illinois, where he died on March 15, 1914, at the age of nearly 85 years. That concludes the 14th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.